did not state or in any way imply that Nicaragua was intending, regardless of peace, to carry out a policy of military expansion with the Soviet Union. What Miranda stated, true or false, was the following. First, in fact, the only newsworthy and, in fact, novel statement that he produced was that the United States had been vastly exaggerating the number of Cuban and Soviet advisors in Nicaragua, which is much lower than what the United States had claimed, according to him, and approximately what Nicaragua had stated. He said that if, in the coming years, if the Contra war declines, Nicaragua would reduce the size of its military forces. That was what he stated. It would reduce the size of its military forces, and it would provide light arms to the civilian population to defend the country against the threat which continues and is constantly raised, the threat of a possible U.S. Military invasion. That means they would try to turn the country into something roughly like Israel, a nation under arms, but of course at a much lower level of military armament. He stated that Nicaragua was the only place where the Soviet Union came into this. He stated that Nicaragua intended to obtain MiG aircraft, jet interceptors. However, he did not state, and you can easily discover if you want, that Nicaragua would be delighted to obtain French Mirage interceptors. They've repeatedly said that. They don't care whether the interceptors they get come from France or the Soviet Union. They'd, in fact, prefer to get them from France because that would terminate the propaganda about their being a client of the Soviet Union. So the fact is they want jet interceptors. Since we've blocked our allies from sending them to them, they're going to turn to the Soviet Union. Why do they need jet interceptors? Well, because at that time, for all we know today, but certainly at that time, the CIA was flying planes into Nicaragua at the level of 2 to 3 a day to provide supplies for the terrorist forces that we had established in the country. That's an enormous supply effort. It was combined with an enormous surveillance effort to provide the Contras with information in real time, sophisticated communication equipment, to provide them with information in real time about the deployment of Sandinista forces so they could proceed to attack soft targets in accord with our directives. And it's well known that the only way that they can try to protect their territory against constant military intrusion by the United States is with jet interceptors. There's no other way to do it. Yes, they're trying to defend their territory. That's essentially the gist of the Miranda exposures. It's kind of interesting that the United States regarded that as scandalous. See, we regard it as scandalous for any country to be able to defend themselves against our attack. If any country tries to obtain planes from France or anyone else to defend itself against our attack, that's a scandal. We've got to destroy them. How can we tolerate this threat to our existence? Let me suggest a question to you. Take the way we talk about this Miranda exposure and about Nicaragua in general, and let's try the following thought experiment. Suppose that there was a debate going on in the Soviet Union about Luxembourg, in which they said, look, Luxembourg is an advanced industrial power linked to the United States, part of a hostile military alliance, Denmark even worse, planes and so on and so forth, tremendous threat to Soviet security. Obviously, we've got to organize a terrorist force to undermine them. Maybe, in fact, given the scale of the threat they pose as compared with the threat Nicaragua poses to us, maybe we would actually, nuke them or something like that. If a debate then, in fact, suppose it went on to say, well, look, if Luxembourg or Denmark obtain jet planes, well, then obviously we've got to bomb them into the sea. How can we tolerate that kind of threat? If a discussion like that were going on in the Soviet Union, how would we react, as far as I know, non-existent Soviet discussion, and see what conclusions you draw about our own political culture from that?
Mr. Perle, what about, shouldn't we believe a defecting Nicaraguan official about their intentions to follow a policy of military expansion with the Soviet Union?
Yes.
Let me ask each of you to make a brief comment about one concluding question, and then I'll ask for final summary statements. And the final question that I would put to each of you is, pick either area that we've talked about, either Nicaragua or in Central America or the Middle East, and say in a few sentences what the United States foreign policy in that area should be now? What would you propose? Mr. Perle, may we start with you?
Well, I happen to think that, broadly speaking, American policy in the Middle East has been aimed and continues to be aimed at trying to help bring about a settlement of the principal disputes that plague that part of the world. In particular, the dispute between Israel and some of its Arab neighbors and the PLO. But I think we have chosen the right basis upon which to attempt to do that, which is a change of a fundamental nature in the threat that an irredentist PLO committed to the destruction of Israel would pose. Professor Chomsky says it isn't an issue of security. It is very much an issue of security. It's all very well to sit in Columbus, Ohio, and say it's not an issue of security, but there have been a number of wars already in the Middle East, each one of which potentially threatened the survival of the Jewish population of the State of Israel, and I think the Israelis have a right to insist on security arrangements that have some hope and some promise of stability, and the United States has by and large been right in supporting those same objectives. It is more than a trivial matter when one talks about the legitimacy of one's right to exist, because as Professor Chomsky knows full well, until the legitimacy of that right to exist is acknowledged, any settlement, any political or territorial settlement, will at best be a temporary settlement in the context of the larger effort to destroy the very existence of a Jewish state in Palestine. And I think the United States is quite right not to align itself with pressures to that end.
Thank you. After Professor Chomsky responds, I'm going to ask you to make the opening concluding remark in about 5 minutes.
So that should be sometime around breakfast.
Okay.
By my reckoning.
I'll try to make it in time for a midnight snack.
Briefly, Professor Chomsky.
Well, let me talk about Israeli security, which I think we should be concerned about. Let me repeat that the comments on Israeli security that I was referring to were not my judgments. They were the judgments of the expressed in the cabinet meetings and of the planning sessions that have been amply documented in the scholarly literature in Israel in Hebrew. For they did not see the issue of security, and rightly so. Because as former head of military intelligence General Harkabi and others will explain to you and do explain to you, the problem of a Palestinian state is not one of security. A demilitarized Palestinian state, which is what it will be, contained in a hostile Jordanian-Israeli military alliance, will undoubtedly improve the security of Israel. But that's not the whole point. See, in my view, here we probably do differ. It's not just the security of Israel that's at stake. Peace in that region will improve the security of Israel. I think that's pretty likely. And steps towards peace would be a step towards Israeli security. But that's not the only issue. There happen to be Palestinians there. There's an indigenous population. And their security counts every bit as much as the security of the Jewish population. So, all of this talk about you're sitting here and not talking about them, if I were to resort to the same rhetorical technique, I would say, I do not do this is conditional, I would say, well, it's very nice to sit here and talk about the security of the Palestinians in refugee camps. That's not the point. We should be concerned with the security of the Israelis and of the Palestinians, and I think there's an obvious way to maximize, not of course guarantee, that security. With regard to the question of legitimacy, if the failure to recognize the legitimacy of Israel, this new concept in international affairs, if that excludes the PLO, then plainly Israel's excluded from the negotiations as well, because it not only refuses to accept the legitimacy of Palestinian nationalism, it even refuses the lower demand, much lower one, of accepting the request of the PLO for negotiations leading to mutual recognition. In fact, it refuses even to allow the Palestinians to choose their own representatives for eventual negotiations. And it is not only putting these forth as statements, it is acting to implement them. Finally, last comment. Even if we were to accept this innovation in international affairs and demand that the Palestinians not only recognize Israel, which they've already stated long ago they're willing to do, but recognize the legitimacy of their dispossession from their homes, even if we impose this extra and novel burden on them. Can anyone seriously believe that such a statement, such a verbal statement, would improve the security of Israel? That's living in a dream world. Security is not based on verbal statements made by some leader under duress. Security is based on arrangements that are created among states and other groups, not on some empty verbiage. Even if they were to produce this statement, it would not contribute one iota to the security of Israel. In fact, it's obvious, and it tells us exactly what the point of those demands is. The point of those demands is to place further roadblocks in the way of a political settlement.
Now for the 5-minute concluding statements. We'll start with Mr. Richard Perle. The podium is yours.
I have sat this evening and listened at, I think, probably greater length than I would have desired, to a vision of a world that I have never seen in my years in government, to the vision of a world in which a small number of men foolishly, in order to enrich themselves, are prepared to inflict suffering and cruelty throughout the world. This is not a policy that I recognize. I trust that for most of you it's not a policy that you recognize. I have heard it said that the National Aeronautics and Space Administration is a front for the Pentagon, that the United States has committed atrocities comparable to Pol Pot, that Europe is a quasi-democratic order, that the reconstruction of the post-war world was done for the convenience and the benefit of a few self-interested men who cared nothing about values, nothing about democratic institutions, nothing about the well-being of anyone beyond themselves. I've even heard it said that when the U.S. managed to assist in an agreement between Egypt and Israel that followed 3 wars and much destruction between those 2 countries, that was intended to assist Israel to retain a military occupation. It's a deeply cynical view of the world, a view said to derive from documents, but I must say to you from a profound misreading of documents. It is a view that recognizes no decency in the making of American policy or its implementation. It is hardly in the interests of enlightenment on this occasion to go through refuting point by point the documents I've not seen. That seems to me quite beside the point. You know from your own experience, you know from your own observations what the people of this country represent, and by and large, although mistakes get made from time to time, and in any human organization mistakes will be made, I think you know and understand what the American people represent and what their elected leaders represent. They do not represent what Professor Chomsky says they represent. And if you believe that that is what this country is all about, if you believe that we are organized principally to serve the selfish interests of a few, and that the historical experience of this country since the war has been dedicated and devoted to that, then I think you will have a lot of difficulty explaining the enormous prosperity, the benefits of democracy that this country has managed to bring to much of the world. And I ask you, as you depart this evening, to consider whether the world you've heard described tonight by Professor Chomsky bears any relationship to the world in which you live and make observations of your own. Thank you.
now for the